Good morning, Morai Rabotai, Chag Sameach, Bruchim Abayim. We are continuing on Masechet Succah, and we have been spending the Chol HaMoed discussing the last piece of the Gemara that we learned about Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli, the two peculiar Gemarot about the greatness of Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli, saying that him and his son perhaps would be the two top people, accepting Pnei Shechinah, like Rashi learns, Bechol Yom, the people who would be entering and exiting with the presence of Shekhinah without permission, even though the Gemara says we have at least every generation 36 special tzaddikim that the world stands on. We spoke about that, if it's nistar, if it's not nistar, but nevertheless, says Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli, if it's two special ones that are not in need of getting permission, so to speak, it's going to be myself and my son. And then we went on a journey to see that it's not just Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli that says it about himself and his son. It's not just the Gemara that says it, that Rabbi Shimon held that him and his son, together with Yotam ben Uziyahu, they would patter up the entire world from the day of creation until the end of all generations, from Din. But really, it is all over the place. It's written all over the greatness of Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli. The Gemara says in Masechet Shabbat Daf Yud Aleph that Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli was v'chaverav. They were patur from learning, from davening, because they were so attached to their learning. They were considered Torato Umanuto. And who is saying that? Rabbi Yochanan is saying that. The great Rabbi Yochanan, the author of Talmud Yerushalmi, saying that Kegon Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai v'chaverav, people like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, that's Toratan Umanutan, that their job, their life revolves around Torah. They are patur even from davening. Kriyat Shema they have to say, but davening, aside perhaps from the Tefillah of Yamim Noraim, they would be patur from davening. Now that by itself is a whole rate by whether or not Rabbi Shlomo bar Yochai, you find him being really the backbone of the question in Masechet Brachot, the famous Masechet Brachot that we've come to so many times in Daf Chaf Zayin, going well into Daf Kaf Chet, that depicted the story of Chachamim basically giving an early retirement to Rabbi Gamliel because of the story that he had with Rabbi Yoshua and so on. And then Rabbi Elazar bar Azariah became the Nasi, and then Rabbi Gamliel was returned. This one was 3 weeks out of the month. Rabbi Elazar bar Azariah was 1 week out of the month. We know the entire story. And at the end of the Gemara says, who was this Talmud that asked this question, whether or not Tfilat Arvit is Chova or not? That's how the whole story started. And the Gemara says, this was Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli. Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli is the one that perhaps did daven, but he was at the same time so attached with his learning that he is the example. He is the picture frame of a person that would be patur from davening. Is so attached to the Torah. Now we had a lot of people who did not walk. Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara says, again, the one that says this, who clearly does not hold that he himself is in that madrega. The Gemara says the chasidut of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan is that Rav would never buy something on credit. He felt that was Chilul Hashem for him. And there's a Gemara talking about what is the Geder of Chilul Hashem, and the Gemara basically mentions that this is very subjective. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Kigoranan, like me, if I would walk without Torah and Tefillin 4 Amot, he would be considered Chilul Hashem. For him, that was Chilul Hashem if he is walking without Torah and Tefillin. Now we spoke about this a few months ago, not long ago. Is it is it Torah or Tefillin? Because Tefillin is not at night. But nevertheless, you're talking about a person that he doesn't walk 4 Amot without thoughts, and yet he's not attached to the Torah the way Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli is. And that's just a side Gemara in Masechet Shabbat Daf Yud Aleph. We mentioned how our Gemara in Daf Mem Hey Masechet Succah is not alone. The Gemara actually says the very same thing in Daf Sadi Zayin in Masechet Sanhedrin. The Gemara says later on, Daf Sadi Cheder, that Rabbi Shimon Ben Levi was standing on the outside door of the Me'ara of Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli, and he asks Eliyahu Navi, he says, do I get to go to Olam Haba and he tells him, Imi yirtzeh Adon ze, referring to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai as Adon. And then the Gemara also goes on to say that he says, I saw two people, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, his father, and the Kol Shlosha Shamati, there was the voice of a third one, which is the Shekhinah. Rashi says that was learning Torah, again speaking about people who are Mekabel P'nei Shekhinah in that way. But speaking about Adon and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai being called Adon, we started with perhaps the greatest controversy around the words of Zohar HaKadosh that we spoke about, and that is that Zohar in Chelek Bet in Parashat Bo, in Daf Lamed Chet, Amud Aleph, on the pasuk in Shemot Lamed Dalet Chaf Gimel says Shalosh Pamim Bashana Hirai Kol Zechurcha Et Pnei Ha'Adon Hashem, that all of the Jewish men have to go see except Pnei Ha'Adon Hashem, the face of Hashem. And the Zohar says Man Pnei Ha'Adon, who is this Pnei Ha'Adon referring to? It is none other than Da Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? Which is obviously a very peculiar word. Now, to begin with, we mentioned in passing that in the discussions 250 years ago, well, at some point, Rav Tzadok HaKohen Milublin, the great Rav Tzadok, he writes that nowadays, if anybody doubts and questions the authenticity of Torah, the Zohar HaKadosh, he is considered halachically an afikores. But again, 250 years ago, this was something that was debated in light of the destruction that came through the students of Shabtai Tzvi, Imach Shemo himself and his students, and Yaakov Frank and so on. People developed a sore point and a very sensitive view, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who himself was the one that actually chased down the Ramchal, and he was the source behind all the charamim that was put on it, all the excommunications and so on. He was a prolific writer. He was a very strong personality, the son of Chacham Tzvi, and he owned his own printing house, so he had no problem with that. He actually, again, he was he wrote things against the. He was actually more involved with Rabbi Yonatan Eibshis, and he wrote full kuntresim and svarim against him, fabricating things just to diffuse the power. And we're talking about Nishichat Nachash, Akitzat Akrav, and so on, things that you will never come across. These svarim have been put in cherem, but nevertheless, he wrote an entire sefer called Mitpachat Svarim against Zohar HaKadosh. The entire sefer, he was immediately put into cherem, and then later on was reprinted, he was put into cherem a second time, and 50 some years ago it was printed again, and it was put in cherem a third time, right? So that's when that's how you become rich. You put something in cherem, and then everyone wants a copy of it. But nevertheless, he writes there. Maran Chida actually writes about this in Erech Zohar. He brings the Mitpachat Svarim, and he tries to be melamed zchut on Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He says, look, he himself never meant to bash the Sefer HaZohar. He says in the beginning that this is a nezer of the Mekubalim, and especially because Ari HaKadosh, who Rabbi Yaakov Emden very much valued, he already authenticized Zohar HaKadosh, and at the end of Sefer also he ends with saying, Sof Tavar, Kol Sefer Zeh, Kodesh Kodashim. So Maran says, which one is it? And Maran says he wrote this, he published this sefer in order to kaka be'atan shel talmidei the students of the Rasha Shabtai Tzvi. This was an act of putting up with those people to try to nullify and diffuse the power and the influence that they were seeking from Sefer HaZohar, that they hung their hat basically on Zohar with all the difficulties that they wanted to bring upon Klal Yisrael. But nevertheless, when Mitpachat Svarim comes across this Zohar, he becomes obviously very alerted. And Yaakov Emden writes in Mitpachat Svarim, he says, I will tell you, there is a ta'ut sofer in this Zohar. There's a ta'ut sofer. When the Zohar says that et penei ha'adon Hashem, it's really saying what we already know from the Gemara Masechet Succah daf chaf bet amud bet. The Gemara there says Shimon ha'amsuni. The Tana Shimon ha'amsuni, prior to Rabbi Akiva, he made it his life project to darshin all of the etin shebetorah. He held that any time that the Torah says et, it is coming to add something. Right? It's one of the most used words in Chumash. And every time you have et, is coming to add something. And he went on darshaning every single one of them, right? Kabet et avicha vet imecha is lerabot achiva gadol. It's coming to add on a deoraita level, and that your older brother or eldest brother, however you slice that, is going to be included in the mitzvah of kibud avam, and so on and so forth, until he got to et Hashem elokecha tira. What are you going to add to the mitzvah of yirat Hashem? And he stopped. He retracted basically his project. And they told him, so all the drashot that you made, what's going to be? He said the famous eternal words of the Gemara, that kemosh kibalti sachar al hadrisha, just like I accepted schar on darshaning, I'm going to accept schar on prisha, right? On separating myself. This is over the boundaries, over the top, I can't. Until came Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva said, no, et l'rabot talmidei chachamim. It's coming to add talmidei chachamim who are attached with the Shekhinah. So says the Yabetz, that is what this Zohar is coming to teach you. So you have to have one word added, right? Instead of saying man penei Adon Hashem, that who is penei Adon Hashem, da Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli, you have to say man et penei Adon Hashem. When the pasuk says et penei Adon, et is rabot talmidei chachamim, and who is a symbol of talmidei chacham that's attached to the Torah, as we just mentioned 5 minutes ago, that a person that's patur even from davening because he's so attached to the Torah, that is da Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli. Now all those three sources, the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Yud Aleph, Gemara Pesachim Chaf Bet, and the Zohar HaKadosh Parashat Bo, Daf Samet Chen, really come together as a complementary, amazing piece of information. That's beautiful, right? By the way, if you would want to put our own 2 senses over here, also would be why is Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli called Adon, right? Adon hazeh, Masechet Sanhedrin Sadichet, right? And Adon here in Zohar HaKadosh. This is Gemara Masechet Brachot. This is Gishmak, right? The Gemara Masechet Brachot of Zayin, the Gemara says that there was nobody that called HaKadosh Baruch Hu an Adon until came along Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu is the first person that called HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world Adon. Lo haya, I'll read you the words of the Gemara. מיום שברא הקדוש ברוך הוא את העולם, לא היה אדם שקראו לו הקדוש ברוך הוא אדון עד שבא אברהם וקראו אדון, שנאמר, זה פסוק בראשית ט"ו ב', ויאמר אדוני אלוהים. מה תיתן לי? So that's language of Hashem with the name of Adonut. It is called Hashem as a name of Adon. That's the name of Aleph Dalet. So nobody was there to call him that. The first person that used the name of Adonut is Avraham Avinu. Why is that? Because Avraham Avinu is the one that Bnei Succah writes this. He writes that Avraham Avinu was the first person that completely and totally submitted himself through a complete submission to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like an Eved. So here the relation of an Eved is to an Adon, to a master. Adon is a master, and the first one that had that complete and total submission was Avraham. Really, we know that Avraham is the name that he had before, right? Avram is Gematria what? 240. Help me out. 43. And then when he became Avraham, it became 248, which happens to be the number of limbs that you have in your body, 248. And Chazal say that this is the control he had over his body. In the beginning, he did not have the perhaps 5 of his chushim, right? The ears and the eye, and the Rosh HaGviyah, the Brit, and afterwards, when he got the Brit and he went through that covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and his name was changed, he had control even on things that is almost supernatural to have control over them. That is total submission. That every limb in his body is dedicated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's his name, right? So perhaps that's why he's called the Adon. He's called the Adon because he's the one that brought that thing. Why? Because who is the man, the Amar, that says this in Gemara Masechet Brachot Daf Zayin Amud is none other than Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, right? Rabbi Yochanan says this, B'Shem Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Lo haya miyom shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu et ha'olam, lo haya adam shekara'u LaHakadosh Baruch Hu Adon, ad sheba Avraham Avinu. That memory was taught by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and perhaps that is because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a duplicate of that in the way that we mentioned before, how the Mefarshim explained that the reason that him and his son and Yotam ben Uziyahu would be the only people to bring atonement to the whole world is because he never accepted a thing in this world. He was so controlled and focused, right? So that's the Adon. But nevertheless, even though that we have this beautiful Hagah from the Yabitz, to put one little et over there and kind of fix the situation and save the day, it's not really the end. That Zohar, as we alluded to it yesterday, is not the end of the story, because there's more Zohars that indicate that even without the et, right? The Zohar Kadosh, for instance, in Chelek Aleph, in Parashat Bereshit, Parashat Vayechi, in the Afresh Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, Zohar Kadosh there says, Rabbi Abba, Laive, we have a Rahida Batred, Rabbi Shon, have a Rachiv, Amar, Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba said, this is running after Rabbi Shimon is a kiyum of Acharei Hashem Yelchu Karye Yishag. You should go after Hashem like a roaring lion. Now there is no et, right? So how are you going to explain that, right? That's not. Well, it's very geschmack what the Abbas writes on Zohar in Pasha Bo, but how are you going to deal with the Zohars in other places? It's not only that. In Hagaot Nisotze Or, on Zohar Kadosh in Pashat Bo, that we just mentioned a minute ago, in Hagaot Nisotze Or Nisotze Zohar, he brings this. And he says, well, he brings the Abitz, he brings the Hagah of the Abitz. But then he says, well, you have later on in Kuf Chaf Daled Amud Bet, Lezimnin Tatayin Aklim B'Shema De'ilah Ha'adon Hashem, V'sham Man Dezachi Be'oraita Zachi B'Shmaya Kadishaya. Someone that is attached to the Torah, says the Zohar Kadosh, he is zoched to be called under the name of the holy name, right? The holy name. And really, it's not just the Zohar. The Gemara Masechet Batra says this. The Gemara in Batra says in the Ainei Amud Bet, Shlosha nikreu al shemo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The 3 things that are called after the name of Hashem. The Gemara says it. What are they? One is tzaddikim, one is Mashiach, and one is Yerushalayim, right? So tzaddikim oftentimes are called after the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? In Yerushalmi, in Bikurim actually says this, when the Pasuk says, V'Hashem Bechal Kodsho, the Pasuk is referring to, this is Yerushalmi and Midrash Shmuel, both. That when the Pasuk says, V'Hashem Be'echal Kodsho, Da Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, Be'kenishta Marduta de Kesrin. This is a reference to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. So you think it's only Rabbi Shlomo Bar Yochai, says the Nisa, says Zohar. It really is said about other people also, and it's because of that Gemara in Masechet Batra that says a person could be called after the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because when a person is completely attached, it's almost like what the Zohar says, that when you attach yourself to Torah, you become one in that aspect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when it says the Hashem Be'echal Kodsho, the pasuk is referring to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar Bekenishta de Kisrin, and Zohar later on also says in multiple places things that are similar. So even though that the most provocative language of Zohar is in Pashat Bo that says Darav Yishom Bar Yochai, and everyone is busy with that Zohar to draw it close, to push it away, but nevertheless this is something that's mentioned in Zohar in other places as well, and it's not only mentioned by Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli, it's mentioned in Yerushalmi about Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, and it's mentioned elsewhere about others as well. And now this goes as early as Rabbi Bachai. Rabbi Bachai writes, I have different prints of this, but that I did. But Rabbi Bachai writes in Shemot Lamed Gimel Zayin on the pasuk of Kol Mebakesh Hashem, that any person that would Moshe Rabbeinu took the Ohel Chutz LeMachane, took the Ohel Moed outside of the camp, Ve'aya Kol Mebakesh Hashem Yetzeh. And anyone that would seek out Hashem would go out. And says Rabbi Bechaya, Haya katuv ra'ui lomar kol mebakesh Moshe. If you needed Moshe, you would go out. I'm mebakesh Hashem. Ela mikan shenikra Moshe b'shem hamiyuchad. This is Rabbi Bechaya, one of the Gdolei HaRishonim. The Moshe Rabbeinu is called to Shem hamiyuchad. When it says kol mebakesh Hashem, is referring to Moshe Rabbeinu in that representation. Because how do you seek out HaKadosh Baruch Hu? By going to Moshe Rabbeinu. Is that type of attachment over there, and it's not only by Moshe Rabbeinu, you find it by Shem and Rivka as well. When Rivka was pregnant, and she has a dilemma of why the pregnancy is unusual, right? Vatelech lidrosh et Hashem, but she's really going to speak to Shem. Vayomer la Hashem, and Hashem told her, well, really Shem told her, as Rashi says, through Shem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, connected with her, but that also is there. Yaakov b'Shem Kel, right? Yaakov is called in the name of Kel, Shenemar vayikra lo Kel Elokei Yisrael, right? And it's really referring to Yaakov Avinu. V'chen matzinu b'Shem Tzadik shenikra b'Shem HaMiyuchad. Tzaddik is called Shem HaMiyuchad, and again, without referencing our Gemara that I just mentioned in Masechet Baba Batra, Rabbi Bechai says this, that you have a tzaddik that could be called that, Hush Katuva Telech et Hashem, and is a reference to Shem, which is called Hashem, Vayomer la Hashem. Again, this goes on, the Rabbi Bechaya, without getting too much into the details of Rabbi Bechaya. We'll just want to show a little piece from Reb Chaim Palaji. Reb Chaim Palaji writes in Sefer Nefesh Korchai. He was a prolific writer, as you know, and he says in Marechet Kuf Ot Bet, Ra'iti mishkatav she'en likro kadosh ki im la'kadosh baruch hu dafka. We can't call anyone kadosh aside from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. En kadosh Hashem, right? Rabbi Chaim Palaji says, I saw someone write this, and I at all don't agree with that, right? Says Rabbi Chaim Palaji, Velo tzadak bazeh. He's not correct, whoever wrote this. Ki hen emet ki kraktiv en kadosh ka Hashem. The pasuk says en kadosh ka Hashem, but that means ka Hashem. No one is like the kedusha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but doesn't mean there's no kedusha in a person. Ki kemo kedushato itbarach eno yachol liyot bebasar v'dam. Can't be like the kedusha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, obviously. Aval pachot mimenu yachol liyot. V'ata techezeh kol 24 in all of the Sifrei Tanakh, Torah Nevi'im v'Ktuvim, meleim b'arbe Ktuvim ha'medabrim b'kedushim asher ba'aretz hema. And then he goes on to answer some of the difficult languages that we say in reference to human beings as well. And again, that becomes another element of this discussion, calling calling tzaddikim in the name of kadosh. Now, we have spoken a lot, and again, I have put here a number of things that there is to discuss. By the way, calling people using the terminologies of kedusha from psukim and using them by human beings is not so. It's not so geschmack necessarily. You know, the first one that I found that really vents about this in a serious way is the Sefer Hasidim. Sefer Hasidim in Ot Taf Kuf Lamed Vav, he writes, and I'll read to you. En meshanin et Hashem klape etiot. You cannot use the name that's referenced to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to use it by a hediot, right? So this is a difference, very similar, but different in that way. That he gives an example of what he found very distasteful. Kegon sheshalach echad lenadiv. This fellow is sending a letter to a rich guy, and he wants to flatter him, chanfen him, and he says to him, using the language of the pasuk, Yehi chavod, instead of Yehi chavod Hashem leolam, right? He says Yehi chavod Adoni leolam. Instead of Nai, Hamonai, he says Yehi chavod Adoni leolam, right? And he says to him, Yismach Adoni v'masav, right? He did not hold back, this person. And the Tzaddik is so upset about this. He says, Lo yitachen, sha'areh Amru, Chazal tell us, Lo yasu ulam keneged ulam. You cannot make a hallway in the sizes and shapes and height of ulam of the Beit HaMikdash. Can't do that. Uchtiv b'matkunto lo ta'asu kamo. You can't make a mirkachat like the Shemen HaMishcha, or a spices like the Ktoret. It's asur, it's asur d'oraita, right? You can't, because you can't use the thing that's used for Kodesh and apply it to Hediot. Lo ta'asu kamo. Al temirenu, you cannot exchange it with chol, right? Over here, Maran Chida, on his Hagahot in this, En meshanin klape hediot, he writes, and I read Maran Chida, V'ani be'oni ra'iti. You think this is bad, right? Says Maran Chida, he says, I saw something worse than this in the same line. Al gabe ktav, unbelievable. Someone actually wrote this. Shenatnu lesarechat. They gave this letter to a ruler, to someone of power and riches, and they write in it, instead of saying Kel Yoshev al Kisei Rachamim, Kel Melech Yoshev al Kisei Rachamim. They wrote Kel is, language of El with Ele Moav, right? Powerful, right? So in reference to him, they wrote to him El Melech Yoshev al Kisei Rachamim, right? In that way, and Maran Chida is in absolute shock and disbelief. V'nista'arti me'od ad hechan shegia ha'chanufa. How much flattery can you have to people? And he goes on this without any tolerance for it. But nevertheless, this opens really, now that we've spent so much time on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it's now befitting probably to read the words of the Ben Ish Chai in the Hakdama to his Sefer She'elot U'Tshuvot, Rav Pe'alim, when he speaks about the Klalei Psak and how a poskim would get to the Psak, and discussing perhaps some of the elements that is important for him. In one point, he talks about how respectful a person, a posek, has to be. He talks about how the Ravad, even though that he was the Skana poskim in the time of the Rambam, he was disrespectful to the Rambam, the way he wrote his chibur, and says, look, nowadays, the kavod of Rambam is 1,000 times more than the Rabbad. We only know the Rabbad because it's Hagahot than the Rambam. Otherwise, it would be lost in the pages. Not exactly like that, but I'm over exaggerating it. But this is so much more kavod. And then he says, from people who were disrespectful, and one of the examples that he gives is the Marshal about the way he spoke about Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli. Now, the Marshal obviously is one of the Achronim, Gedolei Achronim. He's a contemporary of Maran Shulchan Aruch. He was a very sharp personality, and he says, Habitu ur'u, please go and see. Bederech ze mashkara shkiya u'michshol lechacham gadol bedoro. What a shgia and michshol happened to someone great in his generation. If you remember, I have referenced this before a few times in different things. That last time was actually not long ago about the discussion of tefillin on Chol HaMoed, because that is where the tshuva in Siman Tzadichet is speaking about. And in it, he says, well, of course we're not going to listen to the Zohar, Maram Bet Yosef in Siman Lamed Aleph, or Chaim Paskins like the Zohar, that tefillin is asur on Chol HaMoed, and if you put on tefillin, you're chayav mita. It was very strong. So someone asked the Marshal about the halachot of putting on tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and he says, absolutely we don't listen to that. And he goes out of his way to say that if Rabbi Shlomo Bar Yochai would be standing in front of us screaming, we would not listen to him. Right? That's the language he writes. He says, you normally don't pass like Rabbi Shlomo. And the Ben Ish Chai completely is bewildered. He says, you speak about the Tana and Loki like that. I'm not going to read the languages because we're really out of time. But we should be in the middle of tefillah now. But he writes that, I'm sure Rabbi Shlomo Bar Yochai in his greatness was mochel him in Gan Eden, but the reason that a person allows himself to talk is, he gives an analogy. He says, if you stand on earth and look at the ball of the sun, in a small mind of a regular person, you think sun is this big, right? But the only reason that you see the small is because you're so far away from its greatness, right? If you would be a little closer, you would see how 1,000 times bigger than the earth that you're standing on. And that's what he says happened to Marshal, because he's so far away from the greatness of Rabbi Shlomo Bar Yochai. He did not see where he's standing and where Rabbi Shlomo Bar Yochai is standing. He was pretty, heated conversation over here, which B'ezrat Hashem maybe will continue at a different point. Chazak u'Baruch.